Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of the Sustainable Commodities Podcast, a podcast to help people navigate the ever-changing world of sustainability and sustainable commodities. I'm Barnaby Patchett, MD of 199 Agency, a marketing agency working in sustainability, and with me
is Judith Murdoch from Murdoch Associates, and I focus on working with forest risk commodities.
I'm quite excited about this episode because today we're going to be talking about beef. Our guest today is Ruaraidh Petre, Executive Director at Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. The GRSB's mission is to advance, support and communicate continuous improvement in sustainability of the global beef value chain through leadership, science and multi-stakeholder engagement and collaboration.
So let's start off with asking you the question. Can you tell us a little bit about the Roundtable on Sustainable Beef?
Absolutely. So as the description said, we are a multi-stakeholder organization. So we include the whole value chain from producers, farmers and ranchers, and producer associations. So we have several national level associations, and we have the processors, the beef packers and the slaughterhouses. We have the retailers. We have civil society organizations who are involved with that. And we have several allied industries, including the dairy industry, the leather industry, etc. So people who are involved in, at one end or another, with dealing with the same animals that we're dealing with. And then the final constituency that we have is national roundtables. And we have 24 countries involved, but they're grouped into 12 roundtables. Most of them are single countries. So throughout the Americas, you have all single countries from Canada right down to Argentina. But then in Europe, we have a regional roundtable covering 5 countries. Southern Africa, we have a regional roundtable covering 5 countries. And then we have Australia and New Zealand in Oceania. And we're trying to develop closer relationships with a China meat initiative that was established there by the Meat Processors Association there. It's been a little bit tricky to travel to China in the last couple of years, but we're hoping to get there this year.
And who are the biggest producers of beef in the world today?
In terms of countries, the United States has been the largest most years for a long time. Brazil is also a very significant producer. They have a larger number of cattle. So the US has about 90 million head, but they produce a large quantity of beef with that. Brazil produces a little bit less, but with about 200 million head. And other significant, maybe surprising producers to you would be India, which with a national herd of 300 million dairy animals is also a significant provider of both beef and beef from buffaloes, which also enters the supply chain and goes mostly into the Middle East and Southeast Asia.
So that's one question to ask you. What is the definition of beef then? What type of animals? Because obviously just said buffalo. I can picture it, but what is the definition of
well, beef for most people's purposes is just from normal cattle. So the cattle that we produce in Europe or in North America are mostly Bos taurus cattle. And then in more tropical zones, you have Bos indicus cattle. Those are the ones with a hump on them. And then, yes, we do include buffalo meat because they're a large ruminant. It's very, very similar and it enters the same value chain. So buffalo meat is counted as beef in those sort of Middle East and Southeast Asia regions. We don't see a lot of that entering markets in developed countries, though.
Right.
So our background is palm oil. So we're no strangers to controversy in sustainable commodities. I think apart from palm oil, beef is probably the other commodity that gets a kind of bad rep. It's the one that's in the crosshairs of a lot of sustainability circles. But what are the main issues that beef is facing in terms of sustainability?
I guess the two biggest, when we set up the Roundtable, we launched officially in 2012. The biggest thing at that time was definitely deforestation, and deforestation continues to be a significant issue for the beef industry, largely in Latin America. But since that time, what has really increased in public perception of the beef industry is the emission side of things, and particularly enteric emissions of methane. So when cows ruminate, they belch methane, and that has probably become the highest in terms of consumer awareness in developed countries.
Is there anything else? What else is what are the secondary issues that you're facing?
Water use is a significant issue in quite a few countries. That's mostly water use associated with feed production. And if you look at particularly arid regions and in countries like the central part of the United States, from north to south, where you have large numbers of cattle in that region, and it's pretty dry for growing primarily corn, and the aquifers under there are definitely under stress from extraction for all purposes, but beef is contributing to that extraction. So water use is one thing. In some countries where you've got high intensity use cattle, you've got other issues related to runoff from, for example, the very intensive production systems. If that runoff ends up in waterways, you're going to have a problem. You're probably aware of, in the Netherlands, they have a significant issue with nitrogen. And so the Dutch government's policy around livestock is not actually about climate change. It's much more about nitrogen and nutrient enrichment of waterways in the Netherlands. So there are actually different things in every country. And that is why we've got the structure that we do. We've got these 24 national groups because they need to prioritize what are the main issues in their country and address those under a sort of global framework.
Under that umbrella of the wider organization. So how are these individual roundtables and groups driving change?
Well, the most successful ones are those where producer associations are really driving things. And that is probably pretty logical because most of the impacts of beef production do take place at the primary production end of the system. Of course, there are impacts at all stages of the value chain, but if you're looking at emissions, if you're looking at land use, of course, then it's primarily on farm, on ranch that those impacts are taking place. And where the producer organizations have really embraced the need for sustainability and the need for improvement, that is where we're seeing the biggest change, because they've got the network already there. They can pull in other producers. They can make use of national extension services. They can help drive policy. So those are the ones where we're seeing the most positive impact, I'd say. And that's quite a few of them. Throughout the Americas, we've got a lot of pretty strong producer organizations and associations who are really driving change.
And you've mentioned impact there. So what has the impact been so far of your efforts? You've been going, you said since 2012. What's been the biggest change in that time?
To be honest, the first few years were building up the network and even getting people to recognize the need for change. Because a lot of, I think you probably find this in all agricultural fields, but a lot of farmers probably think they're doing the right thing already and don't see a need to change. And what we needed to demonstrate to people was that there is public concern, and if we don't move first, then legislation will move for us. So that recognition was an important first step. Then in 2014, we released a set of principles and criteria, and these were generally embraced by the national roundtables as they built up. And by 2020, we had a really good network of these national groupings ready to do things, and some of them had moved ahead. Canada, for example, had set up a certification scheme for sustainable beef. The United States had set up a framework which can be audited by third-party organizations. So the US Roundtable doesn't run a certification scheme, but they have a framework capable of being certified. Brazil had set up a a guide for sustainable production for ranches, and they did a lot of extension work with that. So we were then in a position to set some global goals. And in 2021, we released our first 3 global goals, and they're on climate, nature positive production, and animal health and welfare. And just last year, we had our global conference on sustainable beef in Uruguay. And at that, in October, we released the first sustainability report, which actually takes a look at how national roundtables are contributing to those global goals. And since it was only a relatively short period between releasing the goals and that sustainability report, it's more of a baseline report showing how they've committed to it and where they stand in terms of it. But there are already some national roundtables who are able to show activities that are contributing directly to meeting those goals.
Yeah, because you've got a target of on reducing global warming by 30%. How are you progressing with that?
So that is an intensity target, and you'll find that's a sort of common way of doing it. So essentially what we're saying is we want to reduce the emissions per kilogram of beef by 30% by 2030. And we wanted to have a time scale that was sort of human. In other words, not set something in 2050 that, I would be long gone from the scene by the time we got there. We wanted something that we would actually be able to show progress against in relatively short term. So reaching that target by 2030 is going to be a stretch, but we definitely have ways of doing it. And most of the national roundtables have committed to a similar target, or in some cases more ambitious targets. So Australia has a carbon neutral by 2030 goal. New Zealand has a climate neutral goal by 2050. The United States has 2040 as a climate neutral goal. So various countries have committed to similar goals, and they all have a sort of different pathway of reaching it because production systems vary so much.
And what are some of those? What are some of the things that are going to help you cut that by 30%? It's a significant amount.
Yeah, well, and again, because it's an intensity target, one of the key things is actually just taking care of all of the good husbandry, management, healthcare, all of those things, which can make you a more efficient producer. Because an intensity target is essentially the same thing as an efficiency target. If you can produce more beef from fewer cows, if you can rear a calf every year per cow, and you can finish that calf at a younger age, these are all things that are going to contribute to it. In the United States, for example, the rise of beef on dairy genetics is making a huge difference, because if you use a good quality beef animal to get an excellent calf off your dairy mother, you're doing two things. One is you're reducing the footprint of the supporting herd, because that cow is already there to produce milk. Mm-hmm. So her emissions are counted in the milk supply chain, and it's only the actual emissions from the calf that count towards the meat. And then you're producing a good quality carcass. Typically, if you always use dairy genetics on a dairy cow, you're going to get very lean, somewhat rangy animals. If you use better beef genetics on that, you're going to get something that's more appealing to the customer and better eating quality. So these are all things that can contribute. One of the weird things that you'd think was already happening but isn't, is having a really good high percentage of animals just being vaccinated against the diseases that they're likely to face in their lifetime. And if globally we could reach a vaccination percentage of only 60%, we'd actually increase productivity of the overall herd by 40%. And that's a huge figure. That could feed hundreds of millions of people, or alternatively, it could mean you could just reduce the size of the herd. So, good management and husbandry is really where it all starts.
Yeah, that's really interesting on dairy cattle then. So is it a different breed? Because Frisian cattle is the one that I would picture as from a dairy point of view. So what is the breed of cattle that you try to aim for?
Yeah, so you're still using the dairy mother. So it's either a Holstein or a Friesian or potentially Jersey. So they're all very typical dairy animals that will have a high milk yield, and that's important to the dairy farm. But what we used to do with all our animals was we breed them true. In other words, we'd always use the same bull on the same cow, so that, the same breed of bull on the same breed of cow, so that you got purebred animals. That's no longer necessary because you can select sex semen, so you can make sure that your best dairy cows are going to the best dairy bulls, and they're producing only female offspring. Yeah. Those become the replacement dairy cows, and then the rest of your herd, you can use a beef bull, say an Angus or a Limousin or something like that on the rest of your herd, and you get a crossbred calf, which is going to be much more beefy.
Yeah, get that.
Interesting. So you've also mentioned one of your other goals is nature positive. So to ensure the beef value chain is a net positive contributor to nature. I mean, we hear these terms quite a lot on the agricultural side in terms of things like nature positive and regenerative farming. And I've heard quite a lot about regenerative beef. Can you tell us more about regenerative beef? What is it?
Well, regenerative as a term is relatively recent. It came after we'd launched the Global Roundtable on Sustainable Beef. And my feeling about the term is, at the moment, it's rather loosely defined. So I'll give you a crack at my own definition and see if that aligns with what you've heard from other people. But essentially, what people mean when they're talking about regenerative is you're using a production system that will be contributing positively to the environment in which it's taking place. So in terms of beef, I'm thinking that you'd be increasing soil health, you'd be improving biodiversity, so you'd be contributing positively to those things. And the knock-on effect of good soil health and biodiversity is it'll probably also help improve water cycling, because better soil health means you get better infiltration of water, so less runoff. Soil moisture retention is better because you got higher carbon and organic matter in the soil. And the biodiversity side is obviously going to, let's say you were to increase the number of species in your sward mixture, that would also create better habitat for invertebrates, insects, etc. And that just has a knock-on effect, because as soon as you got better water cycling, better soil health, you got more microbes in the soil, you got more insects above ground, that's going to contribute to more bird life in the area. You could also, there's going to be some areas of any farm that are not perfect for grass production or cattle production. They might be too steep, they might be too boggy, whatever. Fencing those off and creating sort of micro reserves and maybe improving the biodiversity there by adding tree species, etc. Those are all things that I think would fit in with regenerative. And to my mind, sustainability includes all of those things. You'd need to be doing those things to consider yourself to be truly sustainable.
I mean, I think that aligns with a lot of what we hear from other commodities. That the biggest challenge is there is no standard definition for regenerative at the moment. So there's lots of people calling things regenerative and working in different ways. But with, say, the regenerative beef that you've just laid out, is that possible at scale?
Oh, I think it absolutely is possible at scale. I don't think there's anything in what I just said that would be impossible for a cow-calf producer, or what we would, in the UK, we call them suckler producers. So the people who actually have breeding cows on their property and they're producing calves from them. It's probably a different story when you get to the people who are feeding cattle. So usually what happens after weaning is cattle can either remain on the first farm and they can be fed there on grass or on feed, which could be a combination of silage or other crops. or they get sold and they go to another farm where they're just fed. Now, typically those farms will be more intensive. So they'll have a larger concentration of animals, and they might not be on grass. They might be, really being fed out of feed bunks. And that, I think, would be more challenging, but I don't think it's impossible to do regenerative feeding. It's just that it's not typically aligned with the systems we currently use.
And then looking at cattle welfare, some of the pictures that you see are, and I'm going to say the US, where you see these huge pens full of cattle, and it has a very negative image. How good are those cattle farms that are finishing cattle? And is there a problem with welfare when you keep cattle in such tight areas?
Well, it's been demonstrated that the more space you give cattle, including in feed yards, so, those yards vary a lot. And we have feedlots in Europe. This is not unique to the United States. Here in the UK, we tend to feed cattle in small numbers on farm. So people are maybe not aware as much of that. And then in Europe, I've visited feedlots where they have maybe up to 10,000 animals, but they tend to be undercover. So again, not something that enters the public consciousness in the same way as those large feedlots in the United States. But what I was saying at the beginning was, if you increase the length of feed bunk that's available to each animal and the amount of space they have, they will do better. So there's always an argument for maximizing the amount of space within reason. And this might be counterintuitive, but some of the feedlots I've seen in Europe have actually had less space per animal than those in the United States. And it's partly to do with the system they're using. They tend to keep the animals as entire bulls. So these are actual bulls, uncastrated. And they keep them in the same group for their entire life. And they keep them pretty closely housed. And that stops them from fighting, but it also means they're pretty close together. Whereas in the United States and Canada and other countries where they have those big outdoor feedlots, the numbers of animals are much larger, but the space per animal is also larger.
Do you think there is a misconception about beef? And I come at it from a palm oil angle that, people see pictures of the orangutan and without doubt the destruction of rainforests. Do you think the consumer truly understands what sustainable beef is?
No, I don't. I mean, I think there are going to be some. In any commodity, there are going to be people who've got an interest in sustainability and a concern about it. But the majority of shoppers are not thinking about that when they enter a supermarket. They're buying products based on what they want to eat, what the price is, and their perceptions of quality versus price. And to be honest, I think a lot of people don't think about sustainability on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, we probably would agree to that statement, wouldn't we?
Yeah. But in terms of those that do, so those, again, it comes back to beef getting a kind of bad rep, same as palm oil. You get people, whenever I see increasingly on LinkedIn with this sort of sustainability community, there's always a list with, the worst foods you can eat for the environment. And invariably beef gets put somewhere near the top of that list. Is that a fair assessment, or is that are they measuring, are there any misconceptions around that?
I think the overall misconception is that food systems are systems. Mm-hmm. And if you talk about individual products, it's easy to take some parameters of any product and say, well, that's not great. And, you could do exactly the same for almonds if you wanted, or, any product, really. I don't mean to single out anything, but food systems work because we've got lots of different products and production systems that complement each other. And if you remove something like typically people are concerned about beef, because it occupies a lot of space, but it occupies marginal space that's not actually capable of producing human edible crops. So if you remove the majority of grazing land from your food production system, you're not going to be able to replace cattle with crops because crops don't grow on the majority of that land. So you're going to be left with a lot of cellulosic, grass, basically, that's not much use to humans. The other thing is animal production systems all produce manure, and manure is actually still used as fertilizer for 50% of the crops we produce globally. That won't be the case in developed countries, but in developing countries, that it will be the majority of the fertilizer that's used for crops. So clearly, very important part of crop production is having animals that are going to be complementary to that system. Livestock also consume byproducts from crops. What would we do with all of the cellulosic stalks, straw, stover, whatever you want to call it, or indeed palm press cake, if you didn't have animals to consume it? That they're making use, and they're making a system that's more circular than if you didn't have them there. So I think the overall misconception is that you can separate all of these things out and they're somehow fungible. You could replace one with the other. That's not true. You need all of them.
Yeah. And then that leads nicely onto a question about palm kernel expeller and the EUDR and possible UK regs. What do you think about the EUDR's requirement to have, I think the terminology is animals fed on, and it's really about soya and palm oil. What are your thoughts on the EUDR legislation on feed?
I mean, it's super complicated to trace that sort of thing, and very difficult to demonstrate it. Now, within the European Union or within the United Kingdom, if all imports of soy to Europe are compliant with the EUDR, then any soy that gets fed typically to dairy cattle, not to beef cattle, would be compliant automatically. So then it's not such a problem. The problem would be if you are importing it's actually only beef, because if we're, pigs are not included in the legislation. So if you're importing beef from Brazil, and at some point in that animal's life it had been fed soy, I'm not sure that you can demonstrate that. At the moment, there isn't a system to do that. And it's even difficult for us to get traceability on animals. Obviously, that is a requirement, and there is going to be full traceability on any beef that's brought into Europe after the end of this year. But having true insights into the feed that those animals fed is not something that's currently possible.
Fair enough. So what are your thoughts on the legislation generally? What do you think about EUDR?
To be honest, I think it's a good thing. It's driving traceability, and it's driving transparency. Won't reach everywhere because the EU doesn't import that much beef from the countries of most concern. So to give you an idea, Brazil exports about 3% of its beef production to Europe. So it's not a significant amount of Brazil's production. And I guess Brazil would be one of the countries people were most worried about. It's typically Latin America, South America, and potentially parts of Australia that there is deforestation that the European Union was worried about. So in beef terms, I'm not convinced that it's going to make a huge difference, because a lot of that meat will either be consumed in Brazil or be exported to countries that they don't care about it. But I'm positive about the role it's playing in driving traceability and transparency, because I think that is very important. We can never make sustainability claims if we don't have transparency.
So looking beyond the EUDR, What does the future look like for beef production?
Well, it looks positive. I mean, despite all of the negative press, as you've referred to, there's very strong demand for meat generally, and for beef included in that. Beef is typically more expensive than monogastric meat, so either pork or chicken, but consumers have a preference for it in many countries, not every country. And there is strong demand. And as people become more affluent, they tend to eat more meat. And as the population grows, we tend to sell more meat. So, I don't think the beef industry is in any danger, but we need to maintain consumer trust. And we also need to maintain trust of the policymakers who tend to drive legislation that affects what people eat. If you look at the recent rise to include sustainability in national nutritional guidelines, I think that's an interesting case, because you end up with policymakers who are not necessarily directly linked to food production, making judgment calls about what is or what is not sustainable. And to me, that's an important area to focus on, because, as I think I've probably made clear, it's perfectly possible to produce beef sustainably, but it's also very possible to produce beef in ways that are not sustainable. So what we need policymakers to understand is that where they're driving a policy change, it should be to drive sustainability, not to drive change in consumption.
That's interesting. Yes, the method of production is the important thing that needs to be focused on.
Yeah.
And is there anything in terms of sustainable beef that UK consumers or consumers anywhere could look at? Can consumers look for sustainable beef?
So it depends where you are, and it depends what you want and what are your priorities when it comes to sustainability, because there are certainly certification schemes out there that certify different aspects of sustainability. And some of our members are producing and marketing carbon neutral beef. And then in Canada, as I already mentioned, they have a certification for sustainable beef. And in Canada, you can walk into a McDonald's and buy a certified sustainable burger. Whereas in the UK, you can look for grass-fed, or you can look for other certifications which will tell you something about the production system. They won't necessarily have metrics associated with emissions attached to them, but they can tell you something about the production system. So I think for each person and each consumer, if you're keen to look further into it, you should look for things like welfare certifications, anything that has to do with nature positive or production systems like grass-fed. These are likely to have had more attention to detail and certainly more inspection of the process, because none of the certifications that exist are going to be purely on one criterion. They're gonna look at the overall system, and they're going to take a judgment as to whether that is compliant or not.
Would you ever see a global standard for certification, such as the RSPO?
Well, the difference between palm oil and beef is that palm oil really only grows in the tropics, and the production systems are fairly uniform. Way more than I do, so you can probably say, well, there's a huge difference between a plantation and smallholders, and I get that. But we can produce beef on the equator, on the edge of the Sahara, on the edge of the Arctic Circle. We have so many different production environments. We have so many different legislative environments, and we have so many different production systems that include, dairy that I talked about, pure beef, and various combinations, that I think it would be this is what we actually decided right when we set up. It would be very complicated to try and create a global standard, but what we can do is create an umbrella of a number of different systems in each country. So I think, Canada was the first, but definitely there will be more of our member countries that decide to go for certification. There will be others who have, as the US does, a framework. And there may be some who decide that that's not necessary because the markets that they're selling into are just not interested. But I think there will be a collection of labels under the umbrella of QRSP.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Nice. Okay, so moving on to some nice controversial stuff now. Some nice juicy topics, I think, is probably where we'd like to go. Over the last couple of years, there's been a few news stories around sustainability and beef, really. So at the back end of 2024, ARLA in the UK, the dairy, caused some controversy when they announced they were using a feed additive, Bovaer, to help cut emissions. What are your thoughts on that whole scandal, process, controversy?
I mean, it was interesting to me because this molecule is a synthetic molecule called 3-NOP. It has been really thoroughly researched prior to approval in any country, and now it is approved in several countries, obviously, including the countries that ARLA was planning to trial it in. And my feeling there was, we have numerous pharmaceutical products, for direct human use and for all kinds of veterinary use as well, that are approved. And we don't generally see that sort of kickback. And of course, maybe you could argue that there should have been more of a process leading up to its trialing, where it was people were talked to, etc. But what it made me wonder was, do people ever read the safety labels in just over-the-counter medications they buy in a supermarket? If you were to read the accompanying information with ibuprofen or paracetamol, you might be scared to take it because there are some very rare side effects of all kinds of medications that if you took them all as being, oh, that's going to happen to me, you would never take those products. But they've been trialed. Statistically, we know that if you're using it according to the guidelines and you're a statistically sort of average population, then there is no danger. Otherwise, it would never have been approved. So my feeling about that whole thing was, okay, it was probably mismanaged in the run-up to its release or to its being trialed by ARLA. But the reaction smacked to me a lot of the whole anti-vax thing. I mean, we don't roll out vaccines if we think they're unsafe. We do everything we can to make sure that these products are safe under normal circumstances. And we also inform people about potential risks from either, very rare potential risks from normal use or risks from not using it correctly. So I was confused by that whole thing because I thought, well, this has actually been through more hurdles than some other things that are used on a regular basis because they've just been always there. So we don't think they're dangerous. But, there are plants that grow in fields that are toxic to animals.
Yeah.
I saw it in sort of cultural terms. I saw it as part of the broader culture wars and the shift in political temperature. I just saw it as a kickback against sustainability work as much as anything. This was something that was just a kind of, we've seen the political shift that's happening at the moment, and the cultural shift things have moved very quickly. And I saw it as just being reflective of that. Do you think there's anything to that?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think the whole polarization of all kinds of things, and the ability of social media to really fan flames very rapidly is probably what, this wouldn't have happened, I guess, 10 years ago, because
No.
And I'm not saying that means we shouldn't communicate clearly and honestly about what we're doing, but I also feel people are looking to be outraged in a way, and that may be part of populism or whatever it is, but yeah, definitely part of polarization.
Because feed additives aren't anything new. I remembered, the principle behind this is to cut the methane amount produced by cows. I've seen years ago the idea that there was a seaweed extract or some kind of adding seaweed additive to feed would achieve a similar thing. So it's nothing particularly new in terms of principle, is it?
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, we've been aware that feeding cattle different feeds would have an impact on methane emissions for decades, because emitting methane or producing methane in the rumen is inefficient. What it means is that you're not getting growth from some of the feed that you're feeding the animals, because a certain organism in the rumen is using that to produce methane instead. So we would like to minimize the methane that we produce.
From an efficiency perspective, that's really interesting. From a growth perspective.
Just from that perspective, we'd like to reduce it. And nowadays, because of the carbon footprint involved.
Yeah.
So let's go to one more controversy before
full of them today.
Yeah, well, why not? Why not? In terms of potentially another culture war one, what about the culling of cattle across Europe? We've seen in the last few years, I mean, the one that I heard about certainly was in Ireland, where Ireland was culling quite a significant number of cows to cut its own to meet its own carbon targets, should we say?
Yeah. So it's an interesting one, because I saw exactly the same thing in New Zealand. I was based in New Zealand up until about a year ago, and the government there, the economies of Ireland and New Zealand have something in common, because they're not particularly industrial countries, and they are very good at producing grass. So both countries have got a large ruminant population, and because there's no big heavy industry, the emissions from those livestock end up being a pretty significant part of the country's emissions. So New Zealand had also decided that they needed to reduce the emissions from cattle. And what's happened there is there's been various policy initiatives that have encouraged the planting of pine trees. And there was talk of introducing a methane tax. At the moment, that's with a change of government, that's no longer on the table, but it may come back again. And to my mind, this is just a sort of a trick with global accounting. Okay, for New Zealand or for Ireland, reducing your herd will reduce your national emissions. And because for the Paris Agreement, everybody had nationally determined contributions, they have to reduce their national emissions. But the way we account for food emissions is different than the way we account for fossil fuel emissions. So if we produce food in New Zealand and then sell it to another country, the emissions are counted in New Zealand. Same for Ireland. You count all of the emissions of milk or beef that's produced in Ireland as Ireland's emissions, even if that product, the milk or the beef, is consumed elsewhere. Whereas with fossil fuels, if we mine coal, if we drill oil, if we extract natural gas, the emissions apply to the person who burns it at the other end. And this has created a strange accounting anomaly whereby we're trying to reduce things like food production in countries that are actually relatively efficient producers, but where there's no incentive for a country like Saudi Arabia to pump less oil.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because without a resulting reduction in consumption, there is no net impact, or the net impact could be worse. If you're producing it in a less efficient country, and and you've mentioned Ireland and New Zealand are very good at creating grass, if you're growing it in a country that's potentially using a different feed, then the carbon emissions and the methane emissions potentially associated with it are going to be significantly higher.
Yeah.
I mean, Europe, New Zealand, they export to lower income countries. Talking about Europe, North Africa would be a buyer of significant amounts of dairy out of Europe. North Africa is not great at producing grass. And if they want dairy products, if they want milk or butter or whatever, cheese, then they're going to, they can either buy it from Europe, but that seems to be now declining. So where are they going to get it from? Are they going to produce it themselves less efficiently? Or are they going to try and buy it from another country that's suddenly increasing its production, potentially also in a lower income zone? Or are the people in that country suddenly going to be told, no, you can't have milk anymore? Because if you do that, we're going to see large population movements in search of a better life. There are knock-on effects of policy that people generally don't think about. They think, in short term, yes, we'll reduce our emissions. But Europe has had a problem over the last decades of certainly mounting concerns about immigration from Africa and other continents. That is not going to be helped by stopping exporting food to those regions.
The iron law of unintended consequences.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. Great, thank you. I think that's probably a nice place to end. Thank you very much for your time, Rory, and thanks for all of your insights on it. And to the listeners, thank you very much for listening to the Sustainable Commodities Podcast. Join us next time.
Thanks a lot. Bye.